we're now at the point where we have another keynote speaker. Gary Bloch was on the panel here, but he has agreed to give us a longer talk. So we're very, very much looking forward to that. And Becca Green-Lapierre is going to introduce him. He was just in the back, so he should be. Oh, there he is.
Oh, hey, great. Yeah, so we get have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Bloch again this afternoon. If anyone missed this morning session, Dr. Bloch is a family physician in Toronto. He's an associate professor at the University of Toronto. I'll just wait. Sorry, Marie. Dr. Bloch's been championing social prescribing for almost 20 years. You're a trailblazer for sure. You've been implementing innovative ideas like having financial counselors in your family health team practice, which is pretty cool. You're continually calling attention to the very real causal relationship between poverty and poor physical and mental health outcomes. I used to work as a dietitian in a community health center in Southern Ontario. And I think because of your work, I probably talked about, did you file your income tax returns as much as I talked about fiber? So thanks for spending the day with us. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and your passion.
All right, thank you. And Marie was just coming up, suggesting the idea of physicians prescribing a basic income, which actually is kind of where a lot of my advocacy started, believe it or not, was this idea of putting forward this idea of physicians prescribing income. So maybe it's going to come around full circle. So I've been sitting here through the morning trying to figure out, like, where do I fit into this this space and the story. I mean, we always sort of have imposter syndromes coming into rooms like this that are just clearly so rich and just lived experience, community experience, advocacy experience, just sort of on the ground, you know, decades and decades and decades of real on the ground work around these issues to do with poverty and basic income and social marginalization. And I think I want to offer a bit of a story here it's maybe not quite as dark as how I started off the panel earlier. I realized, I don't know why I was in such a dark mood, but yeah, maybe that's just the realities of where I've kind of lived through professionally over the last couple of decades of work in this area. Hopefully a story that speaks to, you know, and sort of what the kinds of shifts and evolution that I think I've started to see in my world that hopefully provides some hope for the worlds that we're all trying to work within. You know, I mean, and really what I've been engaged in is, I guess, a 20-year struggle to kind of bring real action on social health, social pressures on health, to really force change within the kind of very conservative institutions, institution of medicine and the specific institutions within which I work, really bring about change within the culture of those spaces. To kind of normalize the kind of action on these issues of social inequity that we're talking about today. And so I'm hoping my story of what I've kind of been engaged in over the last 20 years or so will help give a sense of what that process of change might look like. I also want to sort of weave in a bit of a sense of, I guess, sort of my evolution in thought over this time, which I think sort of mirrors some of what we talked about on the panel earlier. an evolution of thought that is really about trying to grapple with, again, this balance between the sort of the beautiful simplicity of some of the solutions and the answers we want to put forward with the real kind of complex realities of people's lives and communities' lives, and the situations and lived experiences in which people actually sit, you know, in their day-to-day lives. So just to situate myself a little bit, because, you know, if we're going to talk about stories, we're going to talk about complexity, I think it's important that you have at least some sense of who I am as an individual and a person. I'm not just a talking head. So I was born in South Africa. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish by background. I came to Canada as a baby, but, you know, as an immigrant with immigrant parents, settled in Vancouver. You know, grew up through youth movements that focused on kind of a utopian socialist Zionist view of Israel. Was kind of a lot of what was at the core of those movements at that time. It's changed. But sort of came through with this real kind of idealism, I guess, which was wonderful and hopeful in many ways, but also a real sense that social change needed to happen and could happen, right? And at that time, it was about youth empowerment, but certainly kind of carried that forward into, you know, searching for where I was going to land professionally. I actually studied colonial and African history in my undergraduate degree, and then decided to go into medicine as a way of sort of pairing that understanding of social realities and the need for social change with a desire to sort of bring some frontline skills to the work that I do. You know, stepping into the medical world was a bit like, I guess, running into a brick wall, I want to say, in terms of, you know, kind of being confronted very conservative, historically conservative, tradition-bound institution that wanted to shape me, you know, at least as much as I wanted to shape there. I mean, this happened, I think, probably about 6 weeks into medical school. There was an event that was a tradition. This is at the wonderful University of British Columbia, a tradition called Women in Medicine Night. And this involved, you know, all the kind of incoming women in the medical class being invited to an event to meet with mentors and hear inspiring speeches and sort of, you know, start to frame out what their career as women in medicine. This event, though, it was a farce. And about 45 minutes or an hour into the event, in drag and blew the whole thing apart, right? So if anyone wanted to know, if any of those women who are coming in there feeling hopeful about their potential place in this institution, I wanted to get a sense pretty quickly of what the institution really thought about where women were going to fit into medicine. It was pretty clear on that night, right? And this is not the 1950s, this is the late 90s, right? So that was a bit of a kind of pull into reality, but I think also a bit of a clarion call to say, you know what, this is the reality of what you're dealing with. And I think that the kind of progression that I want to talk about in the sort of 25 years since then is, you know, the work that I've been doing and that, you know, the sort of large communities of people that I've been working with have been doing to shift that culture, right? And I think we need to think about culture shift and need to think about real, if we want to think about the social change that we're talking about when it comes to implementing something like a basic income. You know, there's sort of, I often look to kind of two big pulls for myself in terms of what keeps me focused on this idea of social health, and also what allows me to kind of present very convincing arguments repeatedly in the medical world around the need to address people's social realities, right? And these polls may seem obvious to you, but I think they need to be stated to sort of reinforce their power. And these are stories, right? And medicine, if nothing else, is a profession in which we sit within the lived reality of people's stories day by day, and not just medicine, but I think all health professions and many other professions as well. And the other pull is the evidence. And, you know, I'm not going to, I could easily spend this half hour and probably 6 hours kind of going through the evidence linking social realities with health outcomes. It's compelling, it's powerful, it is consistent. It's looked at the impact of many different, just about every different social reality you can imagine, in different geographical contexts, in different contexts over time. And it all says the same thing, right? I mean, social pressures are very, have a hugely profound impact on people's health. Probably none has been studied more intensely than poverty and income. Again, I won't repeat it for you. I think Evelyn Forget has spoken here in the past about her work coming out of the Manitoba Basic Income Experiment, which is, I think, a very profound piece of work there, but it's been looked at over and over again from many different angles. But being able to sort of go back to those two basic drivers, the stories and the evidence, has been incredibly useful to the kind of path of advocacy and path and the push towards social change within this conservative institution that I work within. And so I always kind of pull myself back to those drivers repeatedly in the talks that I give, and even, you know, as I sit and meditate on what it is I'm trying to do, and as I sit with these realities day to day. So when I started into this work, I'll say, you know, I started as a kind of pretty idealistic advocate, right? And a lot of the initial work that I did in this area really focused on, you know, advocacy with pretty simple goals, right? I mean, the initial pieces that I was pulled into was real kind of basic anti-poverty advocacy that focused on, you know, initially raising social assistance rates. This idea of prescribing income really sort of rose to the fore very early in my career. It gained a lot of traction, right? This idea that, and there was a lot of interest from the advocate world, the media, and within the healthcare world around bringing out this kind of health perspective on dealing with a core social issue like poverty. I was involved in a very exciting campaign very early on which involved literally prescribing people on social assistance an extra supplement to their income based on their dietary needs, right? And it got huge attention. You know, not surprisingly, the government changed the rules, they shut it down. But it definitely sort of revealed to me the potential for bringing in alternative voices to this type of advocacy and the power that that could bring forward. But it also showed me the limitations of that, right? And there were limitations because there, you know, while there were probably, I'd say 80 or so physicians involved in that work, which was very exciting at that time, it was nowhere close to kind of a mass mobilization of the tens of thousands of health providers that I thought should be involved in that work, right? And when that like kind of real flashy campaign got shut down, it led me to think, what are we going to need to do to bring about the kind of shift and the kind of change within the medical world that will allow us to see all of those, or at least a good number of those tens of thousands of providers mobilizing behind these types of issues, right? And it was pretty clear to me that that was going to require a much slower, much more thoughtful, much more incremental approach to shifting minds and shifting and shifting action than what we had sort of taken initially. So that led to the development of a series of approaches to addressing social issues within healthcare settings that I won't go through all the details of them, but it started with offering up a simple approach to addressing poverty in regular frontline everyday care called the Clinical Tool on Poverty. It suggested a 3-step approach to dealing with poverty as a health issue. People really liked that, right? I mean, certainly not the answer to poverty, but certainly grabbed a lot of attention. It led to the development of a series of team-based interventions, including putting in place, for example, full-time income security experts in our health team, partnering with legal aid clinics to offer direct legal support services to our patients in our team, and then encouraging the spread of that model to other teams around the province and eventually the country. Literacy-focused initiatives. And after a few years, allowed us to even start thinking a little more deeply about what it meant to deal with equity issues on the front lines of care. So we put in place things like teams focused on addressing anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in the front lines of care. We started doing work to understand what it would mean to decolonize our teams, right? To sort of grapple with the realities of being involved in an institution that had been deeply involved in colonial systems of oppression in Canada. And later on, we brought in, and sort of more recently, we've actually started on work to address disability and ableism, right? As part of that work to kind of bring in a more complex understanding of what inequity looks like and what social marginalization looks like. And paired with all of this, we started, or we continued to build skills amongst health providers around advocacy, around working with people to provide them with the tools and provide them with the skills to take what they were seeing on the front lines of care, and support the communities and the individuals they were working with to bring forward those experiences to make social policy change or to advocate for social policy change. We did that through training providers, which, we had some notable success in kind of bringing, creating groups like Health Providers Against Poverty that was mentioned before, which is still an active group 20 years since it was formed, powerful groups on climate change, on migrant health, along with other areas. We even put in place initiatives to encourage, like my very large 250 professional, strong, interdisciplinary family health team to take on group advocacy initiatives to start pushing towards social change. Again, to kind of normalize this idea that working towards social change is just a part of what we do. And finally, research and education, which I won't get into other than to say that, a lot has changed in medical education since those days of Women in Medicine Night. As far as I know, that event no longer exists at UBC. Although it's too painful for me to even look back and see what's going on with it. But there's been huge reform, right? And so I think we see that amongst younger clinicians that are coming out of medical schools now and other health professions programs, there's a whole different awareness around what what social realities look like on the ground and what the complexities are of living with those social realities and what kind of change is needed to truly improve the health of people who are socially marginalized. So that's that's a pretty quick trajectory, right? I mean, and I've kind of painted you a story there of, you know, almost 2 decades worth of work in about 7 minutes. But there's a lot that needs to be done, right? And I think that, and hopefully you're kind of running through your minds and saying, okay, well, what's not being dealt with in this story, right? Like what in the simplicity of that narrative, what is missing? And there's a lot missing there. So I want to offer you 2 things on this front. First of all, and this is something that I think we touched on in the panel this morning. First of all is, again, the need to grapple with and deal with the real complexities of individual narratives and the real complexities of true lived experience on the ground, which involves, as we know, not just stories of poverty or racism or ableism, but deeply interwoven intersectional stories of all of that, right? Played out in different ways with different individuals. And so that's one piece that's kind of been sitting up here. And the other piece is real questions around who owns this work and how we start shifting power within this work from, in my case, health providers and health institutions to communities and to people who are living these experiences on the front lines. And it's both of these that we're exploring in the latest work that we do. And so our latest initiatives fall under an umbrella of something called social prescribing, which is actually a term that I really don't like, but I'm using the term because it's what's used almost universally right now, although hopefully that will shift. Social prescribing is something that was funded in a very large way in the UK from the years before COVID and through COVID. I mean, so much so that it's being offered, you know, it's being funded by government across the National Health Service in the UK. It's being funded by a very conservative government in the UK, which certainly raises red flags. But what it does is it focuses on assessing individual social needs and pairing and developing kind of priority needs list and pairing people up with community services and supports that are available to them, which is, I think, a good concept on its face. I think it is inadequate. And I spent a lot of time thinking about why that is attractive to a very conservative government in the UK. And I think the reason is that the real sort of focus on the individual in the way it's formulated there, this idea of sort of identifying individual strengths and then, you know, drawing on those strengths to kind of carry people forward. But I think there's something that we can do with that allows us to move forward in deeper ways with the kinds of actions towards social change that we've been driving. The first piece that I think that gives me hope in that model is the focus on a very deep understanding of individuals and, I would say, communities' stories. And a deep assessment of social location and social need that sits at the core of this approach. So I think if, you know, if we are able to challenge ourselves to sit and take the time to listen to those complex stories, I think there's hope that that will push us to another level of addressing the realities of social marginalization. The other piece, which is something that I think is somewhat explored in the UK model, but I think we are pushing this even more here as we carry this forward in Canada, is an engagement with this approach as a community development and a community empowerment approach to care, which is something that is radically new for the healthcare world. But in that radicalness, I think actually might be powerfully transformative to the way that we provide care, and especially the care of people who are marginalized, in ways that we really need to be pushing towards. So this is something that I have been involved with very heavily over the last couple of years. It's challenging. It's challenging to me, and it's challenging to the institutions that I work with, but it's challenging in a way that I'm hoping will actually result in the at least or the furthering of a kind of flipping of power structures within this institution of medicine beyond what I've seen to date, which I'm really excited about. So what can we take away from this? First of all, from my experience in this, there is a large group of people within and workers within even very conservative institutions like medicine that are incredibly interested in working towards addressing social impacts on health and on society. I will also say that from what I have seen, these institutions are actually responsive to change. And I've seen real shifts over time, despite the dark picture that I painted of where we're at right now. I have seen real shifts within my worlds around how institutions even locate themselves, institutions of medicine especially, locate themselves in relation to issues of social inequity. We're starting to see funding flow towards this, and there's literally millions of dollars in funding like I've never seen before starting to come out to support these types of social approaches to care. That we're starting to see the voice of those most impacted and individuals and communities most impacted starting to come into this, like closer to the center of planning these models and of impacting these models of care. And finally, that backlash is inevitable. And that's a bit of what I mentioned before, that there is a backlash to this, but that's okay. I think the backlash to me is a sign of success, honestly. And I think it is predictable and it's inevitable. And I think we have to weather it. And we certainly do not want to shrink away in the face of it. So I think I'll wrap up there simply by saying that I hope all of this relates back to this conversation about basic income in some way, right? I think it does. And I think it does in the sense that, you know, similar to the kind of, again, the sort of process that I feel like I've been involved in trying to figure out my space within the medical world. You know, basic income is beautiful in its simplicity, but it has to grapple with complex realities. And I think we are starting to do that. I think we're very much grounding this work in principles of community centeredness and community responsiveness and a real sort of grounding in what community needs truly are from the voice of communities. I hope that's coming. And I think we know that BI is a piece of the story. It's not the whole story, but it is a really important foundation of that platform. And, you know, if we can kind of match what BI offers with what communities and people with lived experience are telling us is needed on the ground, I think it'll form a powerful part of the response to the kind of issues of social marginalization and inequities that we're seeing. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully that offered something of use to this space. And I don't know if we have time for a question. Maybe one. One. Okay. See, we have a minute. Or a thought. Yeah. Yeah, so great question. The question is, what sustains me? So I am in a very privileged position around all of this, right? I mean, my professional, the professional space I'm in supports me to do this work. I am increasingly surrounded by a community of other health professionals who are deeply interested in, as you say, this work towards real social justice. And, you know, it's actually astounding to me the number of people that are involved in this work now compared to how many were involved 20 years ago. I mean, it's literally night and day. So I think that's really powerful. And I think just keeping a vision on where change has happened, I think is really important, right? So, you know, I generally do see a path of progress in what's going on, right? Even if the world feels dark, I think that there is a narrative that is not so bleak. And I see the sort of evolution of that, and I think it continues to evolve. And so I draw real hope from that, right? I mean, I do see a path towards more change and more positive change coming ahead. So I mean, that's really what keeps me going in all of this. Yeah.
How back in Ontario, there's that special diet allowance program and then the government scrapped it. So in Nova Scotia, the Canada Center for Policy Groups put out a Nova Scotia Health Policy. One of the recommendations is to create some type of special allowance for pregnant moms, breastfeeding moms, for example, who may have higher nutrition needs. Do you have any options for advocating for that based on what you've learned in Ontario?
Yeah, a bit of a complicated question. So sorry, I think I have to repeat it for the people online. So the question is whether there's any concerns about advocating for special supplements to social assistance based on healthcare needs like pregnancy or nutritional needs. So again, two sides to that. First of all, I'd say that anything we can get to supplement social assistance in the short term is positive, right? So, I mean, and this is just like social assistance rates are so dramatically below any sense of a reasonable livable level that, you know, every dollar counts in that fight. The flip side to that, and this is where I think the danger may lie, is that we never want to give government an excuse that allows them to move away from kind of basic elevations in the basic level of income offered to people living in poverty, right? So if we advocate for something that's just sort of small and incremental, like a special diet supplement, that could be used politically to detract attention away from the really big change that's needed in income supports, which is going to be far more dramatic and more costly than small changes like that. So I think we just have to be careful in how we frame it. I wouldn't say don't advocate for those types of supplements, but I'd say be very careful in the language that we use to say that this needs to be a temporizing measure, that it's a band-aid, that it's something to offer people, you know, as we wait for the real change that's needed. We're probably done. Okay, thank you.